The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound filling the sterile white walls of the doctor's office. Emily Dawson sat stiffly in the chair, her hands clenched together in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. She had always been the steady one, the hopeful one, the kind of woman who believed that hard work and love could overcome anything. But nothing could have prepared her for the words that fell from Dr. Levin's mouth that morning. "Emily, I'm afraid the scarring from your past surgery has left significant damage. Your chances of conceiving naturally are very slim." His voice was soft, professional, but merciless all the same. The words pressed down on her chest like an iron weight. She couldn't breathe. She turned instinctively toward the man seated beside her, searching for his warmth, for that steady hand that had once promised forever. Adrian Blackwood, heir to a fortune and her husband of 5 years, sat as if carved from stone. His jaw tightened, his hands curled against his thighs, but he didn't reach for her. He didn't even look at her. Dr. Levin continued, "There are options: IVF, surrogacy, adoption. It won't be easy, but—" Adrian cut him off with a clipped, "We'll think about it." His voice was sharp, cold, the kind of voice he used in boardrooms when dismissing a contract. Then he stood, tugging at the cuff of his expensive suit, leaving Emily to stumble out of the office in silence behind him. The ride home was unbearable. Chicago streets rushed by, gray and blurred through the car window. Emily's mind spiraled with what-ifs, with the memory of nights they had stayed awake whispering about the children they would one day have, the family dinners, the bedtime stories. She wanted to reach for his hand, to tell him they could get through this together. But Adrian's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his silence a wall she could not climb. When they finally stepped into their sprawling house, she tried. "Adrian, we need to talk. We need to—" "Not now," he muttered, moving past her. But she followed him, her heart breaking with each step. "Please," she whispered, "I need you to tell me this doesn't change us, that we can still build a life together." He turned then, his eyes dark, his face unreadable. "You don't understand," he said, each word cutting deeper than the last. "I can't live without a legacy, Emily. My family name, my bloodline, it matters. What's the point of all this if there's no one to inherit it?" She felt the floor tilt beneath her. "You're saying I'm not enough," she whispered. "I'm saying I can't stay in a marriage that doesn't give me a family." His voice cracked slightly, but he looked away before she could find the truth in his eyes. That night, when he finally came to her, she thought it was forgiveness. His lips pressed against hers with a hunger that felt desperate, almost frantic. She gave herself to him, clinging to the hope that maybe this was the bridge back to what they had lost, that love would be enough to hold him. She whispered against his skin, "We'll find a way, Adrian. We always do." But in the shadows of that night, his thoughts were elsewhere. To Emily, it was their last attempt at closeness. To Adrian, it was already a goodbye. When dawn crept through the curtains, Emily reached across the bed for him, only to find cool sheets and an empty space where her husband had been. On the nightstand was a note, short and devastating. "I can't do this anymore." Downstairs, the echo of footsteps faded as the front door closed behind Adrian Blackwood. Outside, his mother, Margaret, waited in her sleek black car, her presence as commanding and poisonous as always. She didn't need to say anything. Her satisfaction was etched in the thin smile that curved her lips as her son slid into the seat beside her. Emily sat in the silence of their bedroom, the note trembling in her hand, her body still aching from the night before. Her world had splintered in a single breath. He had left her, taken by the same cold force that had haunted their marriage from the start. She didn't know it yet, but life had planted a secret inside her. The night she thought was reconciliation, the night he thought was farewell, would change everything. For while Adrian walked away in search of a legacy, Emily already carried it within her. Emily stared at the empty space where Adrian had once slept. The cold sheets beside her felt like a cruel confirmation that the man who promised forever had vanished into the shadows of his mother's influence. She clutched the note in her trembling hand, her eyes swollen from a night of tears that refused to stop. The silence of the house screamed at her. Every corner whispered memories of laughter, promises, and dreams that now lay shattered on the polished floorboards. She wanted to scream, but the pain was too deep to find sound. For days, she moved like a ghost. She went to work at the small legal office where she had built a quiet career, smiled politely when her colleagues asked if she was all right, and returned home to an empty mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. The pictures on the walls mocked her. Their wedding photo in Italy where Adrian had kissed her like she was his whole world. The framed blueprint of the Blackwood estate he promised they would fill with children's laughter. Now it all stood as monuments to a love that had been slaughtered by ambition and bloodline. When the nausea began, she dismissed it as grief twisting her stomach. But when it lingered, when mornings came with dizziness and afternoons with exhaustion, she feared something was wrong. One evening she walked into the pharmacy, her fingers shaking as she reached for the pregnancy test. She almost laughed at the irony. After years of trying, years of disappointment, could this really be happening now, when the man who demanded children had abandoned her? Back in the echo of her too-large bedroom, she locked herself in the bathroom. The seconds ticked by like hours. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She closed her eyes before daring to look. 2 pink lines stared back at her. Positive. Her knees gave way and she sank to the floor, her hand pressed against her trembling lips. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were not only of pain. They were tears of disbelief, of something fierce igniting in her chest. She was carrying Adrian's child. No, children. Something inside her already whispered it was more than one heartbeat. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and dialed his number. It rang and rang before a cold, automated voice announced the call could not be completed. She tried again and again, but the line had been severed. Panic clawed at her chest. He needed to know. He deserved to know. But deep down she realized Margaret had already tightened her grip. Her calls would never reach him. The next day she drove to the Blackwood estate, a fortress of glass and stone that once felt like her future. Margaret opened the door with that thin smile that had always made Emily's skin crawl. The older woman's eyes slid over her like she was filth tracked in from the street. Emily tried to steady her voice as she spoke the words that should have changed everything. "I am pregnant." For a flicker of a second, Margaret's eyes widened before narrowing into cold steel. She stepped forward, her perfume suffocating, her voice dripping venom. "How convenient that you discover this after he leaves you. Do not mistake me, Emily. You will not trap my son with lies or bastard children. If you push this, I will destroy you so thoroughly, I will beg for the peace of silence." The door slammed in her face with a finality that echoed in Emily's bones. She stood there shaking, rage battling despair. Alone on the grand steps of the Blackwood Empire, she pressed her hands to her stomach. Inside her was a fragile spark of life that Margaret had already tried to erase, that Adrian might never claim. But in that moment, Emily knew something with unshakable clarity. She would fight for this child. She would fight for herself. She would not be erased. As night fell over Chicago, Emily sat by the window of her small apartment, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and silver. Her heart was broken, her world upended, but in the darkness a fierce vow took root. She whispered to the silent room and to the life stirring inside her. "You will never feel unwanted. You will never know abandonment. I will build a life for you, and I will make them regret the day they threw me away." She did not yet know how heavy the road would be. She did not yet know the nights of hunger, the bills she could not pay, the endless exhaustion. She did not know that her enemies would grow in power as she grew weaker. But she knew this: she would rise again. And when she did, neither Adrian nor Margaret Blackwood would ever recognize the woman she had become. The storm came earlier than she expected. Emily had planned for 9 months, had prepared herself to endure the journey alone, but life had other designs. It was a bitter winter night when she woke to a sharp pain cutting across her belly, followed by the unmistakable rush of water. She was only 7 months along. Panic gripped her as she stumbled across her tiny apartment, clutching her stomach, whispering prayers that her baby would hold on just a little longer. But there was no one to call, no one to rush to her side. Adrian was gone. Margaret had made her promise of destruction clear, and Emily had no family to lean on. It was just her against the world. She dialed for an ambulance, her voice breaking as she gave her address. The sirens wailed through the Chicago night, carrying her to the hospital where fluorescent lights and hurried nurses became her battlefield. Hours passed in a blur of pain and fear until the cries finally filled the sterile air. Not one, but two tiny voices, weak but alive. Twin miracles. A boy and a girl. Emily sobbed with exhaustion and awe as the doctors placed the fragile babies into incubators, their bodies so small she was terrified to touch them. Daniel and Sophie, her children, her reason to keep breathing. Days blurred into weeks as she sat by their sides in the neonatal intensive care unit, her hands pressed against the glass, whispering promises to them through tears. She promised to fight, to protect, to give them everything she had been denied. The hospital became her second home. She learned the rhythm of the machines that kept her babies alive, each beep like a drumbeat of hope. She learned the kindness of strangers, nurses who smuggled her blankets, other mothers who shared stories of survival. One afternoon, a social worker named Maria sat beside her, offering quiet strength. "You're not alone in this, Emily. There are resources, programs, people who can help you." But Emily only shook her head, her eyes fixed on her children. "I can't depend on anyone. People leave. People lie. It's me and them now." Maria studied her for a moment, then nodded with respect. "Then let me teach you how to fight smarter," and fight she did. She worked nights as a paralegal assistant while still recovering from birth, dragging herself home at dawn to feed her newborns and rock them to sleep. She learned how to stretch $1 until it screamed. She learned how to study between bottles and diapers, applying for the part-time law program at Northwestern with determination burning in her chest. She knew what she wanted to become now. She wanted to be a weapon forged in the fire of her pain, a lawyer who could defend women like herself, women abandoned and crushed by powerful men who thought themselves untouchable. But life did not let her have victories without cost. There were nights when she broke down sobbing because the twins cried endlessly and exhaustion clawed at her bones. There were days she nearly collapsed at work because her body had not fully healed. And there were moments when the thread of Margaret's words still echoed in her mind like a curse. Yet every time Daniel gripped her finger with his tiny hand or Sophie's dark eyes stared at her with innocent trust, Emily found the strength to rise again. As months passed and the twins grew stronger, Emily began to change too. The girl who had once believed love was enough was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that strength was born from suffering and that survival was the sharpest weapon of all. Late at night, while rocking her babies to sleep, she whispered the truth to herself. "They tried to bury me. They thought I would break. But I will rise from these ashes and I will build a world where no one dares to make me beg again." She looked down at Daniel and Sophie, their tiny chests rising and falling, and her vow hardened into steel. She was not just a mother. She was a warrior being born, and soon the world would know her name. The years passed like a relentless storm, and every drop of struggle carved Emily into someone unrecognizable from the woman Adrian had left behind. Her tiny apartment became a fortress of love and resilience where Daniel and Sophie learned to take their first steps on floors that creaked and where their laughter filled rooms too small to contain their spirit. By day, Emily juggled a job at the legal aid office where she handled paperwork for desperate clients, and by night she sat in crowded classrooms at Northwestern, her textbooks worn and her eyes burning from exhaustion. She was raising 2 children alone and training herself to wield the law like a blade. There were nights when she stumbled home so tired she could barely carry her bag, but Sophie's bright smile and Daniel's endless questions pulled her back to life. They were curious, brilliant children, too wise for their young age, and Emily saw herself mirrored in their determination. She promised them more than survival. She promised them a life that Margaret Blackwood could never stain, a life where their worth was not measured by the name they carried, but by the strength in their hearts. Emily began to excel in her studies, her professors noticing the fire behind her questions and the precision in her arguments. She specialized in family law, a field soaked in heartbreak and betrayal because she understood it better than anyone. While others studied cases as theory, she saw the faces of women abandoned at kitchen tables, children left voiceless in courtrooms. She became relentless, and soon even the most respected professors at Northwestern whispered that Emily Dawson was destined for greatness. Outside the classroom, she transformed as well. Her wardrobe of plain blouses and hand-me-down skirts was replaced with sharp suits bought second-hand but tailored to fit her growing confidence. Her once timid voice became steady and commanding. She learned how to walk into a courtroom with the presence of someone who belonged, even when she was still only a student. Clients at the legal aid office began asking for her by name, sensing something in her that was stronger than simple sympathy. She was becoming a force, but even as she rose, shadows followed her. Margaret's threats still haunted her dreams. She knew the Blackwoods had resources that could crush anyone who stood in their way, and she feared the day Adrian might discover the truth about the twins. Each time, he looked into Daniel's green eyes, so much like his father's, she wondered when the past would come knocking. Yet rather than paralyze her, the fear sharpened her edge. She trained herself for that confrontation, knowing it was inevitable. On a crisp autumn morning, 5 years after Adrian had walked out, Emily stood at the window of her modest but warm townhouse. The city skyline stretched before her, a reminder of how far she had come. Behind her, Daniel and Sophie laughed as they practiced writing their names at the kitchen table. She watched them, pride swelling in her chest. The children were thriving, strong and brilliant. They were her legacy. They were proof that she had built something magnificent from nothing. That same week, Emily received news that her first major case as a student advocate had been accepted in court. She would be standing before a judge representing a mother who had been abandoned by her wealthy husband, a mirror of her own story. It was a test of everything she had endured. As she prepared her arguments, she realized this was more than a case. It was a message to herself and to the world. The weak girl Adrian had discarded was gone. In her place stood a woman forged by betrayal, sharpened by hardship and unbreakable in her resolve. As she stood before the mirror that night adjusting her blazer, she whispered the vow that had carried her through every sleepless night. They tried to bury me. They thought I would break. But I will rise until they are forced to bow their heads and recognize me. She did not yet know that Adrian's world was beginning to crack, that his empire was crumbling under the weight of poor decisions and greed. She did not yet know that her path and his were racing back toward each other like storms colliding. All she knew was that she was ready now, ready for whatever came next. And when the past returned, she would not tremble. She would fight. Adrian Blackwood sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at a pile of contracts that no longer meant anything. The once proud offices of Blackwell, Odd Construction, had grown eerily quiet. Half the staff laid off, the phones no longer ringing with new projects. The empire he had been raised to inherit was crumbling in his hands like sand slipping through his fingers. He rubbed his temples, trying to drown out the voice of his mother echoing in his mind. You are a Blackwood. You do not fail. You carry the legacy. But the truth clawed at him. He was failing. And for the first time he wondered if the price of that legacy had been too high. At night he found himself wandering his empty penthouse with a glass of whiskey in hand, haunted by memories he had tried to bury. Emily's laugh, the way she looked at him with faith in her eyes. The last night they shared, the way she whispered that they would find a way. He had convinced himself leaving her was necessary, that he had been choosing the greater good. But in the silence of his loneliness, those excuses rotted. He had abandoned the only woman who had ever truly loved him, and nothing he had gained since had filled that hollow space in his chest. Margaret still moved through his life like a general directing a soldier. She pushed him into alliances with wealthy families, arranging dinners with daughters bred to be suitable wives. He sat through them politely, nodding at conversations about charity luncheons and designer villas, but felt nothing. Every smile seemed false, every touch empty. The women looked at him as a prize to be won, not a man to be known, and always in the back of his mind he saw Emily, radiant and unpretentious, who had wanted nothing but love and family. The cracks in his empire deepened when the Peterson contract collapsed, costing them millions. Workers were unpaid, investors restless. At a board meeting filled with tense voices and accusations, Adrian found himself staring out the window, unable to care about the numbers they shouted at him. He wondered what Emily was doing at that exact moment. He wondered if she had remarried, if she had children, if she was happier without him. The thought clawed at his insides more viciously than the threat of bankruptcy ever could. Then came the gala. Margaret insisted he attend to salvage their image, to show society the Blackwoods were still powerful. Adrian dressed in his tailored tuxedo, the mask of wealth covering the cracks beneath. The ballroom was golden, chandeliers blazing, laughter ringing in false harmony. He shook hands, smiled when expected, played his part. And then across the room he saw her, Emily. She was nothing like the girl he had left. She stood in a midnight gown that clung to her with elegant power, her hair swept back to reveal a face sharpened by determination. At her side were two children, a boy and a girl, perhaps 5 years old. They carried themselves with quiet confidence, their small hands tucked into hers. Adrian's breath caught in his chest. The boy's eyes. Green. His eyes. For a moment the world tilted. He felt the floor vanish beneath him, his pulse thundering in his ears. He stumbled forward, desperate to confirm what his heart already screamed. Emily turned then, her gaze colliding with his. No warmth, no recognition of the man she once loved, only steel. She guided the children past him as if he were invisible. But Adrian stood frozen, staring after them, shaken to his core. The empire might have been collapsing around him, but Adrian knew with bone-deep certainty that something even greater was at stake. Those children were his. And Emily had become someone untouchable. For the first time in his life, Adrian Blackwood felt powerless. And he realized the legacy he had sacrificed everything for might already be alive, breathing, and walking out of the ballroom with the woman he had betrayed. The night after the gala, Adrian could not sleep. He lay awake in his dark penthouse, staring at the ceiling while the image of Emily's children burned in his mind. The boy's eye, had been his own, the same shade of sharp green that every Blackwood carried. The girl's smile had mirrored Emily's, bright and defiant. He had tried to tell himself it was coincidence, that perhaps Emily had moved on, found someone else, but deep inside he knew the truth. They were his, flesh and blood, the legacy he had thrown away. He spent the next morning digging through contacts, bribing event planners, searching for guest lists. Each attempt ended in silence, because Emily Dawson no longer existed as the woman he had once abandoned. She was Emily Dawson Blackwood only in the past. Now she was Emily Dawson the attorney, a name whispered in legal circles, feared in courtrooms, and respected by women who had nowhere else to turn. Adrian read article after article, his heart sinking with every line. She had built her own law firm. She had become one of the fiercest voices in Chicago family law. She had created an empire without him. Margaret noticed the shift in him immediately. She cornered him in the marble kitchen of the family estate, her voice sharp with suspicion. "You look distracted, Adrian. This is not the time for weakness. Investors are watching." He turned on her with a glare she had not seen since his father was alive. "Tell me the truth, Mother. Did you know Emily was pregnant when I left?" For the first time in years, Margaret faltered. Her lips tightened, her silence louder than any admission. Adrian's blood went cold. You knew, and you kept it from me." Her eyes flashed with the same venom she had wielded his whole life. "I protected you. That woman was beneath us. She was going to ruin everything. You needed to be free." "Free," Adrian whispered bitterly. "You didn't set me free. You chained me to you and made me abandon the only good thing I ever had." He stormed out, rage burning through him, but under the rage was something worse. Regret. A suffocating weight that left him gasping for air. For 10 years he had convinced himself he was chasing legacy, that leaving Emily had been necessity. But now he saw the truth. The legacy had been there all along. In her. In their children. And he had walked away. Driven by desperation, he began to follow her trail. He sat in the back of courtrooms watching her work, unable to look away as she tore apart arrogant men twice her size with nothing but evidence and fire in her voice. He watched her leave the courthouse with her children, their laughter filling the air as she held their hands. Each time he reached for them, his courage failed. What would he say? How could he explain the unforgivable? But fate does not wait for courage. One evening, as rain poured across Chicago, Adrian found himself standing at her doorstep, soaked to the bone, his chest pounding like a war drum. The lights inside glowed warmly, shadows of Daniel and Sophie dancing across the curtains as Emily read to them. He raised his hand to knock, but froze. Could he shatter their peace with his presence? Could he dare beg for forgiveness he did not deserve? Then the door opened. Emily stood there, framed by light and warmth, her eyes narrowing when she saw him. Adrian. Her voice was not soft, not welcoming. It was the voice of a woman who had built herself from ruins into something unbreakable. The children peered curiously from behind her. Adrian's throat tightened, his voice breaking. "Emily, please. They are mine, aren't they? Let me see them. Let me be their father." The silence stretched like a blade between them. Rain battered the steps, thunder rolled above, and Adrian Blackwood, heir to an empire, the man who had left her broken, now stood on her doorstep trembling like a beggar. He had once demanded a leg, AC. Now he was begging for the right to claim the family he had cast aside. And Emily's eyes burned with a storm of fury and power that told him nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Emily did not move from the doorway. Her body was tense, her hand resting protectively on the frame as though she could physically keep Adrian from stepping into the life he had abandoned. The children watched with wide eyes, sensing something heavy in the air, though they did not yet understand the weight of it. Adrian's chest rose and fell as he stood in the storm, rain dripping down his face, mixing with the salt of tears he could no longer hold back. For years he had been the man who never bent, never begged, but now every inch of him was unraveling. Emily's voice was calm, but beneath the calm was fire. "You do not get to show up after 10 years of silence and ask for a place in their lives. Do you know what we went through, Adrian? Do you know how many nights I sat in a hospital praying they would survive because they were born too early? Do you know how many jobs I worked to keep food on this table while you hid behind your mother's shadow?" He staggered under her words, each one cutting deeper than the last. His lips parted, but no defense came. He could not deny it. He had been gone while she had fought alone. Daniel stepped forward, his little brow furrowed in confusion. "Mom, who is he?" Emily's throat tightened. For years, she had prepared herself for this moment, for the question she knew would come, but now that it had, her heart ached with the weight of it. She looked at her son, then at Sophie, who clung to her brother's arm with innocent trust. "Your father," Emily whispered. The word felt sharp, foreign, almost dangerous. Adrian fell to his knees on the wet ground, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. Emily, I swear I didn't know about them. If I had, I never would have stayed away. Margaret kept the truth from me. I thought you were gone from my life, but all this time..." He looked at the children as though they were the only light left in his dark world. "Please, let me make it right." Emily's eyes hardened, her jaw tightening as she fought the storm raging inside her. She remembered the slap of betrayal when he walked away. She remembered Margaret's venom, the threats to destroy her if she dared speak. And now here he was, begging, broken, but still carrying the Blackwood name that had crushed her once before. She shook her head slowly. "You don't get to erase the past, Adrian. You don't get to heal yourself by tearing open our wounds." But the children would not let the moment pass so easily. Sophie's small voice trembled as she asked, "If he's our father, why wasn't he here?" Adrian's breath caught as he met her eyes, so full of innocence and accusation. "Because I was weak," he said softly. "Because I let someone else control my life. It is the greatest mistake I have ever made." His voice cracked, raw and stripped of pride. "But I will spend every day I have left trying to prove to you that I am not that man anymore." Emily felt something shift inside her, but it was not forgiveness. It was caution, sharpened into armor by years of struggle. She knew men could make promises when the rain was falling and regret was heavy. But when the storm passed, would he still stand? She studied him as lightning split the sky, illuminating the face of the man who had once been her entire world. The man who had shattered her, yet also given her the two greatest loves of her life. She stepped back slightly, but not enough to invite him in. The children will decide one day if they want to know you. Until then, you will not come here uninvited. If you mean what you say, prove it from a distance. Build something worth showing them. Show them you are not your mother's puppet. Show them you can be a man they can respect. Adrian bowed his head, the rain soaking his tuxedo, his hands trembling against the stone steps. He had come hoping for a door flung open, for redemption offered in her embrace. Instead, he was left with a trial he did not yet know if he could endure. But as he looked at Daniel and Sophie, he felt the spark of something he had lost long ago. A reason to fight, not for money or empire, but for family. Emily closed the door, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. She pressed her back to the wood, listening to the storm rage outside and the steady breathing of her children inside. She had survived betrayal, built a kingdom from ashes, and raised warriors of her own. Now the past was at her door, demanding entry, and though she would not let him in, she knew the story was far from over. The storm had only begun, and when it broke fully, it would decide not just Adrian's fate, but all of theirs. The storm outside faded, but the one inside Adrian only grew stronger. After Emily closed the door in his face, he stood there for what felt like hours, soaked in rain, stripped of every illusion he had carried for a decade. The Blackwood heir who once thought himself untouchable now felt like a beggar in front of his own children. When he finally left that night, the city lights blurred with the tears he refused to admit were falling. He returned to his empty penthouse, and for the first time in years he did not pour himself a drink. He sat in silence, replaying Emily's words again and again. Show them you are not your mother's puppet. Show them you can be a man they can respect. The next weeks became a battle between old chains and new determination. Margaret pressed harder than ever, furious at his distraction, furious at whispers she had begun to hear about Emily Dawson, the lawyer who had humiliated one of their business allies in court. She tried to tighten her grip, scheduling meetings with bankers, dictating which women Adrian should escort at charity events. But something inside him had shifted. At one board meeting, when she spoke over him, he slammed his hand on the table and said with quiet steel, "Enough, mother. I will speak." The room froze, his mother's face pale with shock. It was the first time he had defied her in public, and it sent tremors through the empire she had built around control. Meanwhile, Adrian began to appear where Emily least expected. Not at her doorstep, but in courtrooms, in community centers, in the shadows where she fought battles for women discarded by powerful men. He never interfered, but he watched, learning who she had become. He saw her stand in front of judges and tear apart men who thought wealth made them invincible. He saw her comfort clients with the gentleness of someone who knew their pain. Each time he walked away torn between awe and shame. This was the woman he had broken, and yet she had risen higher than he ever dreamed possible. Emily noticed him. She always did. She told herself his presence meant nothing, that he was a ghost clinging to her victories. But in quiet moments, her resolve wavered. She saw the way his eyes followed Daniel and Sophie when they left school. She saw the way he stood in the rain outside the courthouse, not demanding entry, but waiting, enduring, trying. Part of her wanted to believe he had changed. Another part remembered the night he had left her shattered. The battle inside her was as fierce as the ones she fought in court. The suspense grew tighter when whispers reached it. At her that Blackwood construction was collapsing. Lawsuits, debts, betrayals from within. Some said Adrian was finished. Others said he was planning to sell everything to start again. Emily wondered if this destruction was punishment or transformation. Either way, she knew he would not disappear this time. The man who had walked away 10 years ago was now clinging with both hands, desperate to prove he could be different. One evening, as the city prepared for winter, Emily left the courthouse with Daniel and Sophie at her side. A crowd of reporters gathered at the steps, their cameras flashing. They were not there for her case. They were there for him. Adrian Blackwood stood waiting at the bottom of the stairs, not in a tailored suit, but in a simple dark coat, his eyes locked on the children. Reporters shouted questions about bankruptcy, about betrayal, about Emily's name now tied to his. The world was watching, and the children froze. their hands gripping Emily's tightly. Adrian took one step forward, his voice breaking above the noise. "They are my children." The words silenced everything. Reporters gasped, flashes erupted, and Emily's heart slammed in her chest. She had fought for years to protect their truth, and in one moment he had dragged it into the light. Daniel and Sophie stared at him, wide-eyed, the weight of his confession pressing on their young shoulders. Emily's fury and fear collided because this was no longer a private battle. It was war played out in front of the world, and as the cameras captured every second, Emily realized something chilling. Adrian had not just stepped back into her life, he had set fire to both their worlds, and from the ashes would rise either her greatest victory or her most devastating defeat. The city woke the next morning to headlines that blazed across every paper and screen. Blackwood heir admits secret children in shocking sea. Art house confession. The photographs were everywhere. Adrian standing in the cold, his eyes locked on Daniel and Sophie, reporters pressing in with cameras flashing like lightning. Emily shielding her children with her body, her jaw tight with fury. What had once been her private life was now public spectacle, dissected by strangers who knew nothing of her struggle. At the law firm, phones rang without pause. Clients worried, journalists demanding comment, enemies whispering that Emily's reputation as a champion for women was now tainted by her ties to the Blackwoods. Sophia, her loyal assistant, begged her to issue a statement, but Emily's hands shook as she poured herself coffee. "He has no idea what he's done," she whispered. This wasn't just exposure, it was danger. Margaret Blackwood would never allow this scandal to pass without retaliation. Indeed, Margaret was already at work. Behind the closed doors of her mansion, she tore through the morning papers, her fury rattling the glass of champagne she held. For years she had buried the truth, silenced Emily, erased the children from existence. Now her son had undone it all in a single sentence. She called her lawyers, her political allies, even a judge she had once bribed, her voice like venom. Destroy her. Destroy Emily Dawson before she destroys us. Adrian, meanwhile, felt the weight of his confession settle like chains across his shoulders. Yet beneath the fear was a strange sense of freedom. For 10 years he had lived a lie. Now the truth was in the open, undeniable, irreversible. He had nothing left to hide. But truth alone would not win him forgiveness. He knew Emily would come for him, her rage sharper than any courtroom blade, and he would have to endure it because he deserved nothing less. That evening, Emily stormed into his penthouse without knocking, her presence filling the hollow space like fire. "How dare you?" she spat, slamming the newspaper onto his glass table. "How dare you drag my children into your circus? Do you know what this means for them? For me?" Adrian rose slowly, exhaustion heavy in his eyes, but resolve burning there too. "I couldn't lie anymore. They are mine, Emily." The world needed to know. She laughed bitterly. The world needed to know? Or you needed to feel less guilty? Their words clashed like thunder. Emily accused him of selfishness, of using their children to save his crumbling name. Adrian swore it was the opposite, that he wanted nothing of his empire, only a chance to stand before his children without shame. For a moment they stood inches apart, breathing hard, their history thick in the silence. Emily's heart raced because, despite everything, she saw truth in his eyes. But truth was not enough to erase 10 years of absence. While they fought in the privacy of the penthouse, the city outside was already choosing sides. Some saw Emily as a heroine betrayed twice, first by Adrian's abandonment and now by his confession. Others whispered she was a schemer, raising Blackwood heirs in secret to strike at the family name. Margaret fed those whispers, releasing carefully planted stories painting Emily as manipulative and ambitious. Court filings appeared overnight, petitions questioning Emily's fitness as a mother, attempts to drag her into custody battles she had fought for countless clients but never imagined fighting for herself. The suspense wrapped tighter around her chest with every passing day. She was no longer only a lawyer defending broken families. She was the mother at the center of a storm, her children's future hanging in the balance. Margaret had declared war. Adrian had exposed their secret. And Emily Dawson realized with icy clarity that the next battle would not be fought in shadows. It would be fought in the courtroom, under the gaze of the entire city. And she swore as she tucked her children into bed that night, pressing kisses to their foreheads, that she would not lose, not to Margaret, not to Adrian, not to anyone. If the world wanted a war, she would give them one. But in the deepest part of her heart, a terrifying question whispered. Could she fight them both and still protect the fragile place inside her that once, long ago, had loved him? The courthouse was overflowing the day the case began. Reporters lined the marble steps, their cameras flashing as Emily Dawson arrived holding Daniel and Sophie's hands. She wore a black suit that made her look untouchable, her face composed, though her heart was racing. Inside those walls, Margaret Blackwood had arranged her final strike, petitioning for custody, claiming Emily was unfit to raise the heirs of the Blackwood fortune. Emily had defended hundreds of women in these very rooms, but now she was the one on trial. The irony was a knife twisting in her chest. Adrian entered minutes later, flanked by lawyers who looked more like soldiers preparing for war. Yet unlike his mother, he did not wear arrogance. He wore regret, plain on his face, visible in the slump of his shoulders. When their eyes met across the crowded courtroom, the storm between them was louder than the murmur of the gallery. She remembered the man who had abandoned her in a doctor's office. He remembered the woman who had stood in the rain refusing to let him back in. Now the world would watch as their fate was decided. Margaret sat in the front row like a queen surveying her battlefield, her pearls gleaming, her lips pressed in a cruel smile. For her, this was not about children. It was about control, about punishing the woman who had dared to rise after being cast aside. She whispered orders to her attorneys, her gaze never leaving Emily as if sheer hatred could break her down. The opening arguments were brutal. Margaret's lawyers painted Emily as manipulative, a woman who had hidden the children to trap the Blackwoods, who had poisoned them against their rightful family. Emily rose with fire in her eyes and dismantled every accusation with precision. She spoke of raising premature babies alone, of working 3 jobs while studying law, of fighting for her sons and daughters when no one else would. Her voice carried across the silent courtroom, and more than once she saw jurors wipe their eyes. She was not just a mother. She was a warrior. But the suspense reached its breaking point when Adrian took the stand. Margaret expected him to bolster their case, to echo her claims and destroy Emily's credibility. Instead, he looked directly at the judge, then at Emily, and said the words that changed everything. "My mother is lying." He confessed to the entire room that Margaret had known Emily was pregnant, that she had manipulated him into abandoning his wife, that for 10 years he had been a coward hiding behind his mother's control. He admitted his failures, his shame, and begged the court not to punish Emily for his sins. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Margaret's face drained of color, her perfect composure cracking as her own son exposed her schemes. She tried to rise, to shout him down, but the judge silenced her. For the first time in decades, her power slipped through her fingers. She had built her life on secrets, and now every one of them lay bare before the court. The verdict came swift and clear. Full custody awarded to Emily Dawson. No rights granted to Margaret Blackwood. The gavel struck and the sound echoed like thunder. Reporters surged toward the doors, already crafting the headline that would humiliate Margaret forever. Emily gathered Daniel and Sophie into her arms, her tears falling freely now. She had won. Against the wealth, the lies, the legacy of control, she had won. Adrian stood apart, silent, his eyes fixed on her. He had destroyed his mother's empire with a single testimony, but in doing so, he had also severed himself from everything he once thought defined him. He was free, but freedom tasted of ashes. He walked toward Emily slowly, his voice shaking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I will never earn back what I lost. But thank you for giving me the chance to tell the truth. Thank you for raising them into something beautiful." She studied him for a long moment, her heart torn between the memory of betrayal and the evidence of change. Then she nodded once. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. The first step in a long road he would have to walk alone. As they left the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the steps in gold. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, the world hungry for their story. Emily held her children's hands tighter and raised her chin high. She was no longer the broken woman left behind after one final night. She was the woman who had turned betrayal into power, the mother who had raised warriors, the lawyer who had burned an empire to the ground. And as Margaret was led away, her legacy in ruins, Emily knew the truth with bone-deep certainty. The greatest revenge was not the destruction of the Blackwoods. It was the life she had built, the family she had protected, the crown of strength she wore every day. Adrian had cried at her door, begging to be a father. Margaret had tried to erase her from history. But Emily Dawson had written her own story, one of survival, triumph, and fire that no storm could ever extinguish. And that story was just beginning.